The hum of the ultrasound machine filled the quiet exam room at Portland Women's Health Center, and I lay back on the padded table with both hands clutching the thin blanket over my stomach. I was 29, pregnant for the first time, and I had walked into that appointment expecting nothing more dramatic than a routine checkup. I remember the sterile smell of disinfectant, the soft shuffle of papers, and the distant voices drifting in from the hallway. All of it blurred together as Dr. Evelyn Grant, my OBGYN, moved the wand across my belly and studied the glowing screen beside me. Mark sat close to my side, his hand resting gently over mine. His face was bright with anticipation, the kind of hope that made him look younger than his 32 years. He had always been quiet with his dreams, careful with them, shaping them in his mind the same way he shaped the houses he designed as an architect. Then Dr. Grant smiled and broke the silence. She told me everything looked healthy. Then she told me I was expecting twins. For a moment, the words did not make sense. They just hung in the air, too large and too sharp to enter my mind all at once. Twins. I blinked at her, then at the screen where two tiny flickers pulsed beside each other in the gray light. My throat tightened. Instead of joy, panic flooded my body like a fever. I shook my head before I could stop myself. I whispered that it could not be right, that it could not be this, that I could not do this. My voice cracked, and tears spilled before I had any chance to hide them. Mark leaned closer and squeezed my hand, trying to calm me, telling me it was okay in that soft, steady voice he used when the world felt unsteady. But I pulled my hand away. I covered my face, and the sobs broke out of me as if something inside had finally burst. Dr. Grant looked startled. She tried to reassure me that both babies were developing well, that it was wonderful news, that everything was healthy. But I could not hear her. The word twins kept echoing in my head, dragging me backward into a childhood I had spent years trying to escape. I was 10 years old again, tucking crying siblings into bed while my parents argued in the next room. I could see myself carrying laundry that was not mine, cooking meals with hands too small to reach the stove comfortably, running between diapers and homework while my mother sat idly and my father disappeared into another bottle. I had been the second mother in a house with 8 children and too little hope to share among us. Long before I understood what adulthood truly meant, I had promised myself I would never repeat that life. I had made the promise fiercely, without compromise. 1 child. That was all I would ever have. 1 life to nurture fully. 1 child I could love without drowning in exhaustion. 1 child who would never be crushed under the weight of endless responsibility the way I had been. And now there were 2. My sobs grew louder, raw, and uncontrollable. Mark touched my shoulder with tentative fingers. He tried to explain to Dr. Grant that I was just overwhelmed, that we had not expected it. But I could feel him reeling too. Not from fear the way I was. Later, he would admit that a part of him had felt wonder. He had dreamed of a family larger than 1 child, even though he had kept that dream quiet because he knew how firm I had always been. To him, twins had felt like an unexpected blessing. But even then, watching me collapse under the weight of old memories, he swallowed his joy. He put me first, as he always tried to do. He told me I was not a little girl anymore. He told me I was not alone. He told me this time it was me and him together. I shook my head through tears and told him he did not understand. I told him I could not do 2 babies. I could not survive 2 babies. He kissed my forehead and told me I would not be doing it alone. He promised we would figure it out together. The appointment ended awkwardly, with me clinging to tissues, my cheeks blotched red, while Dr. Grant printed ultrasound photos in a cheerful tone that felt almost cruel to my ears. Mark tucked the photos into his jacket pocket before I could push them away. The drive home was silent. Rain traced long lines down the car windows, blurring the gray streets of Portland. I leaned against the seat, trapped inside my own thoughts. Mark kept one hand on the wheel and the other on my knee, giving me steady warmth without forcing me to speak. He knew enough about my past to understand why the news had struck me like a blow, though even he did not yet understand the deepest parts of the scar. Our life together had not begun with panic. It had begun in the most ordinary place, a marketing office in downtown Portland. I had been a junior coordinator then, staying late to draft advertising copy and polish brochures until my eyes burned. Mark had already been making his name as a rising architect, and he had been brought into a joint project to design promotional material for a housing development. We met over stacks of plans, mock-ups, and brochures. We were both tired, both frustrated, and somehow laughter slipped into the space where annoyance should have stayed. That laughter turned into coffee breaks, then late dinners, then long walks along the eastern promenade overlooking Casco Bay. I was guarded. I did not trust easily. But Mark was patient, and his patience wore down my walls brick by brick. 2 years later, we married, in a modest ceremony by the ocean, surrounded by a small circle of family and friends. With our savings, we bought a small plot of land on the outskirts of Portland. Mark poured himself into designing a home just for us. He sketched every corner with me in mind. He built wide windows to let in the coastal light, a backyard large enough for children someday, and a cozy kitchen where he pictured me baking. To him, the house was more than wood and nails. It was a promise. It was stability. It was the foundation of the family he hoped we would build. When we pulled into our gravel driveway after that appointment, I stared at the house that was supposed to be my safe place and felt frozen. Inside, it smelled faintly of cedar and the sea breeze that slipped through the cracks. Mark helped me out of the car and held my hand, even when I tried to pull away. In the living room, I sank onto the couch and buried my face in my hands again. He crouched in front of me and told me this house, this life, had been built for us and for our family. He told me it did not matter whether that family meant 1 child or 2. He told me we would make it work. My sobs softened into shaky breaths. I looked at him with swollen eyes and asked if he really thought I could do it. He told me he did not just think it. He knew it, because he would be with me every step of the way. For the first time since the clinic, I let myself lean against him. The fear did not disappear, not completely, but inside the steady circle of his arms, a sliver of comfort appeared. It was fragile, but it was the beginning of hope. That evening I sat alone in the living room while rain whispered against the windows and the old house creaked softly around me. Mark had gone upstairs to sketch in his office, giving me space because he knew I needed it. The ultrasound images lay on the coffee table, 2 tiny silhouettes on glossy paper that I could not bear to study for too long. When my fingers brushed the edge of the photos, my mind slipped back decades away from Portland and back to the heart of Pennsylvania, where my story had begun. My childhood had never been the kind of memory people describe with warmth. I grew up in a cramped house that smelled of damp wood and cigarette smoke, with peeling paint on the porch and a roof that leaked every spring. My father had once been a promising factory worker, but he surrendered to alcohol long before I was old enough to understand what addiction truly meant. By the time I reached school age, his presence was more often found in a bottle than at the dinner table. My mother did not work. She drifted through the days in a haze of bitterness and resignation, nursing her own disappointments, while never lifting a finger to ease the burden on the rest of us. That left me, the eldest daughter among 8 children, to become the person who held everything together. At 10 years old, while other girls were learning to braid hair for fun or ride bikes across the cul-de-sac, I was learning how to keep a household from collapsing. I cooked basic meals with trembling hands, stirring pasta in a dented pot while my baby brother wailed in the background. I scrubbed laundry in a rusted sink and pinned damp clothes on a line strung across the yard. I braided my younger sister's hair before school. I packed lunches when there was enough bread to go around. I tucked children into bed with stories I barely had the energy to tell. There were no Saturday sleepovers for me. There were no carefree afternoons at the mall, no lazy mornings, no easy childhood. My childhood was a ledger of responsibilities, tasks to complete, mouths to feed, tears to wipe away. And no matter how hard I worked, there was never enough. Not enough food, not enough money, not enough tenderness. Just survival. Even when small moments of happiness appeared, new clothes from a church charity, a birthday cake made from box mix, the thrill of a snow day, they were brief flashes before the demands of a house with too many children and too little love swallowed everything again. That chaos was where I made my vow. 1 child. That was all I would ever bring into the world. 1 child I could devote myself to fully. 1 child who would never feel invisible. 1 child who would never be asked to carry burdens meant for adults. I carried that vow like a shield into adulthood. It was why I was cautious in relationships. It was why I distrusted anyone who spoke too eagerly about building a big family. When I met Mark, I told him early, almost defiantly, that one child was my limit. He nodded. I saw the flicker of hesitation in his eyes, but he never argued. Now, years later, sitting in the warm house we had built together, I thought of that shield and how flimsy it suddenly seemed. My life with Mark was nothing like the house where I had grown up. Our home was filled with light. Large windows framed the sea in the distance. The smell of cedar and fresh paint still lingered in the beams Mark had measured, cut, and nailed with his own hands. Our kitchen gleamed with stainless steel appliances, and the counters were usually clear, except for the vase of fresh flowers Mark often brought home from the farmer's market. Most evenings were quiet and warm and ordinary in the best possible way. We cooked dinner side by side, sometimes pasta tossed with herbs from the small garden I had insisted on planting. We took walks along the shoreline and laughed into the salty wind. On weekends, Mark tinkered with home projects, while I browsed books or planned recipes I wanted to try. There were no shouting matches, no slammed doors, no younger siblings crying for attention I could not give. It was in every sense the life I had dreamed of. It was proof that I had broken free from scarcity and chaos. It was my happily ever after, carefully built, piece by piece, fragile and precious. And yet, with Dr. Grant's words still ringing in my ears, I felt that fragile life tilting. 2 children. The number alone threatened to unravel everything I had worked so hard to protect. I imagined sleepless nights stretching endlessly, double the crying, double the costs, double the fear that I would fail. My childhood clung to me like a shadow. I could still hear my father's slurred voice from the porch. I could still smell the sour beer on his breath. I could still feel the ache in my small arms from carrying a baby on one hip while balancing a pot of boiling water with the other. I had escaped that world, but had I escaped it enough to keep it from repeating? Upstairs, I heard the faint scratch of Mark's pencil as he sketched. He was planning the next addition to our home, a sunroom he thought would catch the best morning light. Mark was always building, always hopeful. That was who he was. I, meanwhile, felt as if I were crumbling inside. I loved him deeply, and I wanted to give him the family he dreamed of, but 2 children at once felt like stepping back into a nightmare I had sworn I would never relive. I pressed my hand to my stomach and trembled. 1 child, I reminded myself. That had been the promise. But fate, it seemed, had decided otherwise. 9 months later, the house Mark had designed for peace echoed with the sound of new life. At Maine Medical Center in Portland, I gave birth to 2 healthy baby boys, and their cries pierced the delivery room with a chaos that felt almost holy. I was exhausted. Sweat dampened my hairline. My hands trembled from hours of labor. But when the nurses placed my sons in my arms, the weight of them felt surreal. 2 tiny bodies, 2 red faces, 2 wriggling little lives, each with a steady heartbeat pressed against me. Mark leaned close, his voice thick with emotion, and whispered their names. Aiden and Cole. He had wanted one name to honor his grandfather, and I had agreed. The other name I had chosen myself. Together we spoke them aloud like a prayer. Aiden Dawson and Cole Dawson. Our sons. Mark's joy was unrestrained. He moved around the hospital room in a blur, thanking nurses holding one baby while I held the other, taking picture after picture on his phone, as if he could capture every second before it slipped away. His laughter was soft and reverent, a sound I had rarely heard from him, and despite my exhaustion, it made the corners of my mouth lift. My joy was quieter and more hesitant at first. For a while, all I could feel was the shock of doubling. 2 mouths to feed, 2 bodies to cradle, twice the work I had braced myself for. But as the days bled into nights, and I learned the rhythms of my newborn sons, something inside me shifted. I discovered that holding one baby while hearing the soft coo of the other did not feel like drowning the way I had feared. Instead, it felt like a strange, expansive fullness I had never expected. Love did not divide between 2 children. It multiplied. The weeks after we brought Aiden and Cole home were a blur of feedings, diaper changes, and stolen naps. Our house, once quiet, now pulsed with life. I learned to distinguish their cries. Aiden's cry was sharper. Cole's was deeper and more guttural. I found myself smiling at the way they flailed their arms, as if they were already arguing in some secret language only they understood. Mark kept every promise he had made. He shared every task. He paced the hallway at 3 a.m. with a baby cradled against his chest. He built a rocking cradle in the garage during the day. In the evenings, he whispered stories to them about houses he would design and places he hoped they would see. Slowly, my fear began to fade. I would sit in the nursery rocking one son while the other slept nearby and feel something I had not felt in years. Peace. My vow of only one child began to feel less like a rule carved in stone and more like a shield I no longer needed. Outside our home, the Portland suburb where we lived revealed itself more fully to me now that motherhood kept me close to the neighborhood. Our street curved gently through rows of tidy houses, some freshly painted, others weathered by salt air from the nearby coast. Older couples tended rose bushes. Young professionals rushed off to work. Parents pushed strollers in the evenings. We fit comfortably into the rhythm of suburban life. But not every house on our street told a story of stability. Across the way lived a young couple with a little boy, Liam, who was about 3 years old. I had noticed them before the twins were born, but in the haze of new motherhood their presence became sharper in my mind. His parents often came home with grocery bags that clinked faintly with bottles. Their laughter was too loud, too careless. Liam trailed behind them in worn sneakers, his small body swallowed by oversized clothes that never seemed warm enough for Maine's long winters. My heart clenched every time I saw him. His hair was uncombed. His cheeks were pale. His little hands were bare, even on mornings when frost still lingered on the grass. I caught glimpses of him standing by the chain-link fence in his yard, staring at my twins when I carried them outside for fresh air. His eyes were large and solemn, too old for a child his age. Mark noticed the way I looked at him. One evening, as we watched Liam toddle behind his parents while they carried 6-packs of beer instead of toys or books, Mark reminded me gently that Liam was their child and that it was not our place. I nodded, but the image of that boy stayed with me long after our front door closed. I could not shake the ache in my chest. I had 2 babies now. 2 sons I could love and protect with all the strength I had. And yet, whenever I looked across the street and saw Liam's thin shoulders hunched against the wind, I felt a sharp tug in my heart, as if fate were whispering that my story with him had not yet been written. The afternoon everything changed. The wind swept off Casco Bay, carrying a cold drizzle that turned the Portland sidewalks slick and gray. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders as I hurried home from the salon, my freshly trimmed hair plastered damp against my cheeks, despite the umbrella in my hand. Mark had taken the car to work, so I had to walk the mile from the bus stop back to our neighborhood. Most days I did not mind the exercise, but that day the sky felt heavy, and all I wanted was to get home to my boys. As I turned the corner near an abandoned house, an old clapboard place with peeling paint and sagging gutters that had sat empty for years, something caught my attention. It was a faint rustle, almost swallowed by the rain. I slowed and squinted through the drizzle toward a thicket of overgrown bushes near the side fence. At first I thought it might be a stray cat or a raccoon. Then I heard it. A thin, uneven whimper. A child's whimper. My heart lurched. I called out softly and stepped closer, rain splattering across my boots. A small figure shifted beneath the dripping branches. When I knelt down and saw him, my breath caught. It was Liam, the little boy from across the street. His jeans clung to his legs, soaked through. His socks were muddy and he had no shoes on. A threadbare sweater clung to his tiny frame, and in his arms, he gripped a stuffed gray rabbit, its fur matted from the rain. His lips trembled when he looked up at me, wide-eyed and pale. I whispered his name and asked what he was doing out there. He hugged the rabbit tighter, his shoulders shaking. His voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Daddy was mad. Mommy was mad. The words were broken, but I understood enough. My throat tightened. I reached out carefully so I would not frighten him and told him he did not have to stay outside in the cold. I told him to come with me and let me get him warm. For a moment, he hesitated. His eyes moved from my hand to the wet ground, as if he were trying to decide whether trust was safe. Then, with a shiver too big for his tiny body, he crawled out from beneath the branches and let me guide him by the hand. By the time we reached my front door, I was drenched. I ushered Liam inside quickly, and the warmth of the house wrapped around us. The smell of cedar and the faint lavender scent from the diffuser made the contrast almost dizzying. I hurried him into the laundry room and gently peeled off his soaked sweater and jeans. I promised him I would find something dry. I searched through the closet until I found a set of pajamas with bright dinosaur prints, a gift someone had brought for Aiden and Cole that was still too big for them. I slipped the fabric over Liam's chilled skin, and the sleeves hung far past his wrists. I brushed the damp hair from his forehead and told him that was much better. In the kitchen, I warmed milk and stirred cocoa powder into it until the rich scent filled the air. I handed him the steaming mug, and he cradled it carefully in both hands. He sipped it slowly, closing his eyes as if the warmth traveled straight into his soul. The nanny, who had been watching Aiden and Cole, came out of the nursery with a puzzled expression and asked who he was. My heart skipped. I had not thought that far ahead. I forced a smile and said he was a neighbor who had come over to play with the boys for a little while. She raised her eyebrows, but she did not press me. I told her she could head home early, and once the door closed behind her, silence settled over the house. Liam sat at the kitchen table, sipping cocoa, his stuffed rabbit drying on a towel beside him. I leaned against the counter and stared at him. Something deep inside me twisted, an ache mixed with a fierce urge to protect him. Then the front door opened and I jumped. Mark stepped in, shaking rain from his jacket, briefcase in hand. He froze when he saw Liam at the table. He set his briefcase down slowly and asked why Liam was there. I swallowed hard and told him I had found him outside in the rain, freezing, hiding by the abandoned house. I told Mark I could not just leave him there. Mark rubbed a hand over his face and told me I could not simply bring him into our home like that because Liam had parents. That sentence snapped something in me. I told him through breaking tears that those parents did not take care of him. I told him Liam had been soaked through, shivering and alone. I asked what kind of parents let that happen. Mark crossed the room and lowered his voice. He said he knew it was awful, but Liam was not ours. He said that if we got involved without thinking, it could cause trouble. He said we had to return him. I said no immediately. I clutched the back of a chair as tears spilled down my cheeks. I told him I could not send Liam back there. I told him he had not seen how cold Liam was, how scared. I begged him not to make me. Mark exhaled. Frustration and worry etched across his face. He knelt beside me and took my hands. He told me we had to be smart. He reminded me that Liam was not our child. He said that if we wanted to help, there were proper ways that we could report what we had seen and talk to someone, but sneaking Liam into our house was not the answer. I shook my head and sobbed openly. I told Mark I knew what it felt like to be forgotten. I knew what it felt like to be the one nobody looked out for. I told him I would not do that to Liam. The air between us thickened with tension. The only sound was Liam quietly sipping cocoa at the kitchen table. My heart hammered in my chest, torn between the fear of overstepping and the certainty that I had crossed a line I could never uncross. Mark looked at me at my trembling hands and tear-soaked face, and I think he understood that this was only the beginning. The weeks that followed were uneasy. I could not stop seeing Liam crouched in the rain, clutching his stuffed rabbit as though it were the only anchor he had in the world. Mark had gently but firmly walked him back to his parents that night, and I had watched from the doorway with a sickness in my chest. Even afterward, Liam's face stayed with me. I caught myself looking across the street more than before, my heart tightening each time I saw him wandering the yard alone or following behind his parents like a shadow. Mark tried to reassure me. One evening, as we stood at the kitchen sink washing bottles, he told me we had done what we could. He said that if there was real neglect, the system would step in. But the word system made my chest ache. I knew what systems could mean for children. Strangers, uncertainty, a life shuffled from one place to another. Then came the night everything changed. It was a Saturday in early spring, and the air was still sharp with lingering cold. I had just tucked Aiden and Cole into their cribs when my phone buzzed with a message from the neighbor 2 houses down. The text asked if I had heard there had been an accident. My stomach sank. I typed back immediately and asked what had happened. The reply came within minutes. The couple across the street had been in a car crash. Neither of them had survived. I froze in the nursery doorway, the baby monitor casting pale light across my hands. The sound of my son's breathing softly should have comforted me, but all I could hear were the words on that screen. Neither of them made it. By the next morning, the neighborhood was alive with whispers. News moved fast in suburban Portland. Liam's parents had been driving home late, both drunk, when their car swerved off the road and struck a tree. The details changed slightly with each retelling, but the ending was always the same. They were gone, leaving behind a little boy with no one eager to claim him. I stood at the kitchen window, staring at the darkened house across the street. I could almost see Liam's small silhouette against the glass, even though I knew it was only my mind painting him there. At the grocery store that week, I overheard more pieces of the story. A clerk leaned across the counter and said relatives had come in, but they did not seem interested in taking the boy. They only asked what would happen to the house. Another shopper shook her head and said Liam would probably end up in foster care. My hands trembled as I placed milk on the conveyor belt. Foster care. The words felt like ice in my veins. I imagined Liam's wide eyes staring up at strangers. I imagined him being handed from one temporary home to another, clutching that gray rabbit as his only constant. I pictured him being forgotten in the shuffle, lost the way I had once felt lost in my own childhood home, invisible among too many children and too much neglect. That night I sat on the living room floor, with Aiden and Cole crawling around me. Their tiny hands tugged at my sweater, and their laughter bubbled up like music. But my gaze kept drifting toward the window. I pictured my sons in Liam's place, alone, unwanted, dependent on a system that could not possibly love them the way a parent should. The thought made my chest seize. Tears blurred my vision. I pulled Aiden close then, Cole, hugging them so tightly they squirmed in protest. I whispered that I would never let that happen to them. But as soon as the words left my lips, my mind circled back to Liam. Who was whispering that promise to him? Mark found me later, rocking both babies in my arms, even though they were long past due for sleep. He set down his work bag and asked what was going on. My voice cracked when I told him Liam was going into foster care. I told him his relatives did not want him. I told Mark they only cared about the house and the money, and I asked what would happen to that little boy. Mark exhaled slowly and ran a hand through his hair. He said he did not know, but I could not carry it as if it were ours to fix. I shook my head as tears streamed freely. I told him he did not understand. I could not just stand by and watch. Not Liam, not after everything I had seen. I told him I would not let him be tossed around like he did not matter. The conviction in my own voice startled me. For weeks I had been weighed down by fear, but now a different kind of fire lit inside me. The thought of Liam being swallowed by the foster system felt unbearable, like a wound I could not allow to open. That night, as rain tapped gently against the windows, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I thought about my childhood in Pennsylvania, about being the eldest daughter, forced into the role of second mother. I thought about how it felt to be invisible. I thought about Liam's trembling voice in the rain telling me Daddy was mad and Mommy was mad. My decision crystallized with terrifying clarity. I could not let him disappear into the system. Not while I had a voice. Not while I had arms strong enough to hold him. Not while I had a home with room to spare. I turned toward Mark, who was sleeping soundly beside me, and whispered into the dark that I could not let Liam go. I waited until after dinner to say it aloud. The boys were asleep in their cribs upstairs, and the house had settled into its nighttime rhythm. Mark sat at the kitchen table flipping through architectural sketches, a pencil balanced between his fingers. The lamplight cast soft shadows across his face. He looked calm, grounded, exactly the way I needed him to be. But my chest ached with the words pressing against my ribs. I could not keep them inside any longer. I said his name and told him I wanted us to adopt Liam. The pencil dropped from his fingers and rolled across the table. He blinked at me as if I had spoken another language. He asked if I understood what I was saying. I told him yes. I told him Liam's parents were gone, his relatives did not want him, and he would go into foster care. I asked if he understood what that could mean. I told him I could not let it happen. I would not. Mark leaned back and exhaled heavily. He told me adoption was not simply wanting to help. He reminded me there would be responsibilities, expenses, lawyers, home studies, court hearings, months of paperwork, background checks, and financial reviews. He told me it was not as simple as opening our door and saying Liam could stay. I told him I knew. My hands trembled, but my tone was firm. I told him I had looked into it. I had read everything I could find. I told him I did not care how hard it was, because Liam needed us. Mark rubbed his forehead, his voice tight, and asked about Aiden and Cole. He reminded me they were still babies, and that we barely slept as it was. He said adding another child might not be fair to them, or to us. My voice broke as I leaned forward. I told him it was not fair to Liam either. Liam had not asked for any of this. He was 3 years old. If we did not step in, he would be bounced from stranger to stranger, growing up thinking no one wanted him. I told Mark I knew what that felt like. His expression softened, but the conflict in his eyes was clear. I could see him thinking about Liam tagging along awkwardly on our short neighborhood walks, about the boy's tentative smile when I gave him cocoa, about the way he lingered near our fence, as if he wanted to belong somewhere. Against his own caution, Mark had begun to feel protective of him too. He let out a long breath and told me he did not want Liam to suffer either, but he said this was big. It would change everything. I whispered that everything was already changing, and maybe that was okay. We sat in silence with only the ticking of the kitchen clock filling the space between us. Finally, Mark reached across the table and covered my hand with his. He told me that if we did it, we would do it right. No shortcuts. We would go through the court, Child Protective Services, and the entire legal process. I agreed. Relief rushed through me so fast, tears slid down my cheeks. I nodded again and told him I agreed. The following weeks became a blur of phone calls, appointments, and forms. We met with a caseworker from the Maine Department of Health and Human Services who explained the foster system and what it would take to pursue adoption. We filled out paperwork, we submitted to background checks, we opened our home to inspection. I scrubbed every corner of the house until it gleamed, anxious before every visit, terrified of making one wrong impression. Mark rearranged his schedule, balancing deadlines at work with court dates and agency meetings. At one point, we met with Liam's extended relatives, an aunt and uncle who had driven up from Massachusetts. The conversation was brief and painfully matter-of-fact. They said they could not take him. They said they did not have the time, space, or money. Then, his aunt said it would honestly be better if he went to a family who actually wanted him. My heart twisted at those words, but Mark squeezed my hand under the table. He could see the fire in my eyes. He knew I would never back down. Months passed. Paperwork shuffled from one desk to another. Hearings were scheduled and postponed. Each delay felt like a small agony. Then, at last, we stood before a judge in a small courtroom in Portland. I held Liam's tiny hand in mine, and my heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. The judge looked over the documents, then lifted his gaze to us with a measured expression. He asked if we were prepared to assume full responsibility for Liam, financially, emotionally, and legally, as if he had been born to us. My throat tightened. I whispered yes. Mark nodded firmly and said yes too. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. By the authority of the state of Maine, the petition for adoption was granted. My knees almost went weak. Tears swelled in my eyes as I bent to hug Liam. He looked at me uncertainly, then at Mark, and then he leaned into my embrace. That evening, we returned home as a family of 5. The air inside the house felt different, brighter and fuller, as though the walls themselves understood something had changed. Mark and I led Liam down the hallway to a small bedroom we had painted pale blue. A quilt was folded neatly on the bed, and shelves were stocked with toys and books. I told him it was his room now. His eyes widened. His small fingers brushed the quilt as if he were testing whether it was real. Then he looked up at us, shy but clear, and asked if he could say hi to his brothers. Tears spilled over as I nodded and told him of course he could. Together, we walked into the nursery, where Aiden and Cole were stirring from their naps. Liam stepped closer and peered into their cribs. He whispered hello, his smile tentative but hopeful. Mark slipped an arm around my shoulders, and in that moment it became clear. Liam was not a visitor anymore. He was ours. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the heater and the faint rustle of wind off the bay when I walked into the kitchen one night with both hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea. I paused in the doorway and watched Mark at the table. He was bent over a sheet of graph paper, pencil in hand, sketching with the familiar intensity that meant he was already lost in a new design. I hesitated. My heart was beating faster than it should have been, for days. I had carried a secret that felt too fragile to speak aloud. But that night, with moonlight spilling across the floor, I knew I could not hold it in anymore. I said his name quietly. He looked up with an absent smile and asked if I could not sleep. I stepped closer, set my mug on the table, and fidgeted with the hem of my sweater. I told him I needed to tell him something, but he had to promise not to laugh. His brows rose, and he said he would never laugh at me. I drew in a deep breath and told him I was pregnant. For a second, the pencil froze in his hand. His eyes widened as he searched my face for any sign that I was joking. He said the word pregnant as if it were impossible. He reminded me that Dr. Grant had said the chances were almost 0. I told him I knew. My voice trembled, but a smile broke through my nerves. I told him I had taken the test 3 times. I had gone back for blood work that week. It was real. I was pregnant. Mark pushed his chair back so quickly it scraped across the floor. In 2 strides, he was beside me, pulling me into his arms. His breath caught as he held me. One hand tangled in my hair, and the other pressed against my back as if he needed to make sure I was real. He told me this was the happiest moment of his life. Tears welled in my eyes, and I whispered against his chest, asking if he was sure. I told him it was a lot. We already had 3 little ones. He stopped me before I could keep spiraling. He tilted my chin up so I had to meet his gaze. His eyes shone with awe and certainty. He told me this was not a burden. It was a miracle. We had thought it would never happen again, and yet here we were. He said we were being given something we had not even dared to hope for. I laughed softly through tears and told him I had been so scared to tell him. He kissed my forehead and said scared was the last thing I needed to be. He said he felt like the luckiest man alive. He looked at our life and said Aiden, Cole, Liam, and now another little one made our family fuller than he had ever dreamed. In the days that followed, our home seemed infused with new energy. I caught myself humming while folding laundry, my hand drifting unconsciously to my stomach. Mark, true to who he was, immediately began planning. One Saturday morning, he spread blueprints across the dining table and told me he wanted to expand the backyard. He pointed to a spot where he imagined building a swing set. He marked another place for a sandbox. He reminded me that I had always wanted flower beds along the fence and said we would add those too. He said it would be a space for all of the children to grow up together. I leaned over his shoulder and studied the lines he had drawn. I asked if he really thought we could manage all of it. He slipped an arm around my waist, pulled me close, and said we had managed everything else, so why not this? Just then the twins toddled through the room. Aiden dragged a toy truck. Cole clutched a worn blanket. Liam trailed behind them carrying his stuffed rabbit. They crowded around the table and peered at the drawings with wide eyes. Liam pointed to the sketched swing set and asked what it was. Mark grinned and told him it was where he was going to fly higher than the trees. Liam's face lit up, his smile bright and unguarded. My throat tightened at the sight. It was moments like that, small and ordinary flashes of joy, that reassured me we were doing the right thing. Spring crept slowly over Portland. The snow melted into soft earth, and our backyard became a canvas for transformation. Mark dug into the soil and set posts for the swing set while Liam helped carry tools. I knelt by the fence and pressed seeds into neat rows, my hands dirty and my heart full. Aiden and Cole squealed from their playpen nearby, watching every movement as if the whole yard had become a show just for them. By the time the sun dipped low, the yard held the beginnings of our dream. Wooden beams rose for the swing set. A frame waited for the sandbox. Fresh soil lay dark against the budding flower beds. I stood with one hand on my stomach, the faint swell beneath my sweater reminding me of the new life growing inside me. Mark joined me, wiping sweat from his brow, his smile tired but content. He wrapped an arm around my shoulders and asked if I could picture it. The kids running, flowers blooming, laughter everywhere. I leaned into him with tears in my eyes and told him I could. For the first time in a long time, I really could. As the evening light bathed our unfinished garden, hope settled deep in my bones. For years I had feared that too many children would break me. I had feared that my past would repeat itself. But standing there with Mark, surrounded by the children we already loved, and the promise of one more, I realized something I had never allowed myself to believe. Love had no limits. 3 years passed, and the Dawson home blossomed in ways I never could have imagined. The backyard that Mark had once sketched on paper was alive with color and sound. The swing set stood sturdy against the sky. The sandbox was filled with buckets and shovels. Flower beds lined the fence with bursts of tulips and daisies. The house itself hummed with the rhythm of family life, noisy and messy, but undeniably full. On a golden summer afternoon, we gathered to celebrate Sophie's 3rd birthday. She had been born on a rainy June night, a small miracle I had once thought impossible. and now she was bright-eyed and laughing with dark curls bouncing as she toddled across the lawn. We spread a checkered picnic blanket over the grass and covered it with plates of sandwiches, bowls of fruit, and a pink frosted cake waiting to be cut. Aiden and Cole, now rambunctious 6-year-olds, darted back and forth across the yard in a game of tag. Their laughter rang out like bells, their legs moving so fast I could barely track them. They were inseparable mirrors of each other in spirit, even when they did not always look alike. If one stumbled, the other reached down instantly to pull him back up. Near the picnic blanket, Liam sat with Sophie, carefully holding a small comb in his hand. The shy, uncertain child I had first known had grown into a boy with quiet confidence, especially when it came to his little sister. He leaned close to Sophie, his tongue pressed in concentration as he tried to braid her short curls into something like pigtails. He gently told her to hold still. Sophie giggled and said it tickled. I watched from a few feet away, my chest swelling with emotion. The sight was so simple, yet it struck something deep in me. My children were together, caring for one another, in ways I had once feared would never be possible. Mark settled beside me on the blanket and handed me a glass of lemonade. He asked what I was staring at so intensely, though his smile told me he already knew. I nodded toward the children. I told him to look at them. Aiden and Cole running wild, Liam fussing over Sophie as if she were made of glass. I asked if he could believe this was our life. Mark followed my gaze, and his expression softened. He told me he could believe it because we had fought for it, and because I never gave up. I swallowed hard as memories tugged at me. There had been a time when I had begged fate for only one child. One because I thought that was all I could manage without losing myself. One because the weight of my childhood still pressed heavily on my shoulders. And yet there I was, mother to 4, 2 born of my body, 1 chosen by my heart, and 1 I had never expected, but cherished with every breath. Tears stung my eyes as Liam looked up and caught me watching. He proudly said Sophie was his little sister, and that she was already beautiful. I pressed a hand over my mouth, my heart aching with tenderness. Sophie beamed at his words and threw her arms around him with sticky, frosting-covered fingers. Liam laughed and led her, completely unfazed by the mess. Aiden and Cole barreled toward the blanket, demanding cake, their cheeks flushed and their hair damp with sweat. Mark corralled them with mock sternness and promised cake only after everyone sang. Soon our voices rose together, off-key but joyful, while Sophie clapped her hands and blew out the candles with one determined puff. As I watched the candle smoke curl upward, the years folded in on themselves. I remembered the sterile clinic where I first learned I was carrying twins and the terror that had gripped my chest. I remembered Liam shivering in the rain, his small voice trembling with fear. I remembered the gavel striking in the courtroom the moment he became ours. I remembered the disbelief in Mark's eyes when I told him I was pregnant again, and the miracle of Sophie's arrival. Every moment had led here, to this picnic, to this messy backyard filled with laughter and love. Mark reached for my hand and intertwined his fingers with mine. He murmured that I used to be afraid there would not be enough of me to go around. I nodded, my throat tight. He asked me what I thought now. I squeezed his hand and looked at our children tumbling together in the grass. I told him that now I knew love did not divide, it multiplied. My heart was bigger than I had ever thought it could be. Mark kissed my temple and said that was all he had ever wanted for me to see. The evening stretched golden and warm. The air smelled of cake and flowers, and the sound of children's laughter rose above the hum of summer. I leaned against Mark's shoulder and let my gaze linger on my family. For the first time in my life, I felt completely unburdened by the past. The cycle I had feared would consume me had been broken. In its place stood something new, a family stitched together by both fate and choice, held steady by love. The sun filtered through the maples at the edge of our yard, scattering golden patches of light across the grass. It was late afternoon, the kind of summer day that seemed to stretch lazily toward evening. Family picnics had become a ritual for us by then. Sandwiches packed in a basket, lemonade poured into mason jars, and a blanket spread wide beneath the sky. That day carried a quiet significance. Sophie, now 3 and toddling with more confidence every week, had decided she was ready to take longer steps across the uneven lawn. Her curls bounced as she wobbled forward, arms stretched wide for balance. I sat on the blanket with my breath caught in my throat, my hands hovering as if I could catch her from several feet away. Liam walked beside her, his small hands steady near her shoulder, without holding on. He had grown into his role as big brother, with a tenderness that sometimes made my chest ache. He told Sophie she had it, that she should keep going, that he was right there. Behind them, Aiden and Cole shouted cheers as though their sister were running a marathon. They yelled for her not to fall, then laughed with pride at her determination. Sophie stumbled once, her tiny shoe catching on the grass, but Liam's hand was there instantly, steadying her before she could go down. She looked up at him, her face breaking into a grin, and pushed forward again until she collapsed into my waiting arms. The yard erupted in applause, led by Mark's deep, joyful laugh. He clapped Aiden and Cole on the shoulders as if they had been her personal trainers and proudly declared that their sister was already a champion. I hugged Sophie tightly, my heart thudding with relief and wonder. When I looked up, my gaze swept over all 4 children gathered around me, their faces flushed with sunshine and happiness. The picture they made together was almost too much to take in. I thought of the road that had brought us there, the ultrasound room where I first panicked at the thought of twins, the rain-soaked day when Liam was a shivering figure clutching a stuffed rabbit, the courtroom where a gavel changed our lives forever, the night I whispered to Mark that I was pregnant again, when hope had seemed impossible. Each moment had felt like a breaking point when I was inside it, and yet together they had become stepping stones leading to this exact scene. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. Happiness, I understood then, did not always come the way I planned it. Sometimes it arrived as 2 babies instead of 1. Sometimes it appeared as a neighbor's child who needed a home. Sometimes it slipped quietly back into my life after I had been told it was impossible. My heart swelled with a truth I had once resisted. Love did not deplete. It grew, expanding to hold every soul entrusted to it. Mark lowered himself onto the blanket beside me and looped an arm around my shoulders. He nodded toward the children, who were already chasing one another around the yard again, and murmured that they were something. I leaned into him, my head against his chest, and whispered that they were everything. For a moment, we sat in silence and watched them dart through the grass. Sophie's laughter was high and sweet. Liam's steady voice called after her. Aiden and Cole tumbled through friendly competition. The late afternoon light bathed them all in gold, wrapping the scene in a warmth I wished I could hold forever. My mind flickered back to the frightened young woman I had once been, the woman who swore she would only ever raise 1 child because she believed that was the only way to keep herself safe. That woman would never have believed this moment was possible. But there I was, surrounded by living proof that fear could be reshaped into strength, and that scars from childhood could be healed by the very love I had once been afraid to give. I kissed the top of Sophie's head, then looked at Mark with tears in my eyes. I told him we had made it. He smiled and brushed my cheek with his thumb. He said, yes, we had, and he would not change a thing. As the sun dipped lower and cast long shadows across the grass, peace settled over me. We were not perfect. There would be scraped knees, sleepless nights, hard conversations, and challenges we could not yet see. But we were whole. And that wholeness, earned through pain, choice, and love, was more beautiful than anything I had ever dreamed. The day ended with our family gathered close, laughter rising with the evening breeze. The blanket was messy with crumbs, the children's clothes were streaked with grass stains, Sophie's fingers were sticky with frosting. Aiden and Cole were flushed from running. Liam still hovered near his little sister, ready to steady her if she stumbled again. To me, it was perfect. It was the picture of a life not planned, but chosen, again and again, every day. And as twilight settled over Portland, we sat together in our backyard, the Dawson family complete, our hearts wide enough to hold it all.